Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Breaking Convention, the Matrix Trilogy. So Breaking Convention is a series I'm doing to express an opinion on film that goes against popular opinion or the majority opinion that is overwhelmingly expressed on the internet. Breaking Convention is not very likely to win me more subscribers and is probably more likely than not to gain more dislikes than likes. However, I'm not doing Breaking Convention to win any popularity contest. I'm doing it to express an opinion I and others share that seldom gets heard because it is often drowned out on the internet by the opposing opinion. A saying I was always quite fond of was just because something is popular doesn't mean it's correct, and so I'm here not only to express opinions but to back them up and explain why I and others may feel this way, and even though they may be in the minority, they are still valid. And I'll just start by giving a spoiler warning for the Matrix Trilogy. So, I say on every Breaking Convention video I do that I expect to get more dislikes than likes. However, so far I've gotten far more likes than dislikes on all of my Breaking Convention videos. However, in this case, I really wouldn't be surprised if I did get more dislikes than likes because I'm about to say something pretty controversial. However, it's not something I feel that strongly about. The previous Breaking Convention video I did where I stated Star Trek Nemesis is better than Star Trek 2009 is something that I feel so strongly about I almost don't even consider it an opinion and would strongly disagree with anyone who felt otherwise, and I couldn't really see where they were coming from. However, in this case, I don't feel that strongly about it. This is simply my opinion, and I can totally understand if someone doesn't feel this way, but if I'm honest with myself, this is how I feel. So, without further ado, the minority opinion I'll be expressing today is that The Matrix Reloaded is better than The Matrix. So, I prefer the second Matrix film to the first. Now, I'll give you a few moments after your head explodes. But if I'm honest with myself, this is how I feel. So I'm just going to explain why I feel this way, but first off, I want to talk about the third Matrix film, Matrix Revolutions, because I fully agree with the common consensus that this movie is no good. In fact, if anything, I take it further than the common consensus and say that the third movie is complete and total dog shit. So if anything, I hate the third movie more than most people. In fact, it really annoys me when people say The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions in the same breath, as if there's not that much difference between them in terms of quality, when personally I think the difference is huge. To me, saying the second and third Matrix movies are just as good as each other is like saying that Terminator 2 and Terminator 3 are just as good as each other. I'd say the difference between the second and third Matrix film is just as vast as the second and third Terminator films. So now let me get into why I preferred Matrix Reloaded to The Matrix, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that I don't think as highly of the first Matrix film as most people do. So I first saw The Matrix when it was released in 1999, and at this time there was a string of sci-fi fantasy films that used a similar method of storytelling that this film did, that is, making you think that the film was about one thing but then totally pulling the rug right out from under you, where the characters realize what they think is reality is something completely different. In the case of The Matrix is when we find out about halfway through the movie that what Neo thinks of as reality, set in present-day America in 1999, is actually a computer-generated fictional world, and really they live in a distant future where machines have enslaved humanity and harnessed them for energy and created this fictional world of the Matrix to keep their minds occupied, to have them believe that they're actually living the life when really they're not, in order to keep them docile and obedient. So The other movies I'm speaking of that came out around this same time are Dark City, The Truman Show, and The 13th Floor, all of which came out in 1998, and I'll give a quick spoiler warning for those films as well. Anyway, The Truman Show is probably the one that is the least like it, because we know from the beginning that Truman is living in a fictional world made for TV. It's only Truman who doesn't know this, and he learns about it through the course of the film. However, the effect on his character is the same as it is in The Matrix. The 13th Floor isn't a particularly good movie, and watching it now, it's extremely dated. But it is essentially did the same thing as well, as it was about someone using entering a computer-generated world of the 1960s, only to find out what he thinks of reality is just a computer-generated program being run from the future. And then there's Dark City, the film where the people find out the city they think they live in is really a spaceship where aliens are using them for experiments, where they constantly wipe their memories and change their lives around. And I'll be honest, I actually think Dark City is a much better movie than The Matrix, and I was much more impressed with it, but that's just me. However, just because there are other movies similar to The Matrix that came out around the same time doesn't necessarily mean it's not that good. The Matrix does have some really good qualities. Like, I like that it has a lot of philosophical implications, as I read a lot of articles written trying to relate the idea of the Matrix to modern society. That is, that there are many societal norms we think of as actual reality, and it has natural as like the oceans and the air we breathe, but really they are nothing more than constructs of society and only exist because we believe they exist. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the heroes in the Matrix took on the roles of anti-society hackers and the villains took on the roles of government agents. So there are many great philosophical implications, so I do think it's definitely a good film. I'm just not as blown away by it as many others seem to be. And the most likely is due to the fact that I'm not a huge fan of long drawn out action sequences. I mean, I like action movies well enough if they have good story, but I don't like action for the sake of action, and these films sometimes border on that. As for The Matrix as it relates to its sequels, while I think it's true The Matrix has a huge advantage over its sequels in the sense that it is a film that pulled the rug out from under you, and you can only do that once. The other thing that was really impressive about The Matrix was it managed to keep the secret even through the trailers. And even though I've seen a bunch of trailers before I saw this movie, I still had absolutely no idea what the secret was until it was revealed halfway through the movie. So that was really impressive that they managed to keep it hidden. And with the sequels, you already know the secrets, so it wasn't as impactful. So because of this, everyone else was saying that the first movie was much better. So I convinced myself that it was better, but when I actually sat down and watched these two movies back to back, I had to admit to myself that I didn't think it was better. Even though the first one was more groundbreaking in that regard, overall I find the actual story of the film a bit lacking. As most of the film was about Morpheus making Neo aware of what is going on, and then Neo learning to adjust to the new world. And overall, I found the characters and the stories that take place kind of bland, if I'm being perfectly honest. And it just feels overloaded with a lot of bloated action sequences, and it didn't do as good of a job as getting me invested in the world. While I liked the ending action sequence, I wasn't blown away by them and found it a bit wanting. Whereas The Matrix Reloaded just felt like a fuller movie that was more vibrant and got me to care about the characters more. I felt much more invested in Neo and Trinity's relationship, as I felt this film did a wonderful job of fleshing them both out. And Morpheus's backstory with Niobe helped flesh that character out as well. And I also felt that Link was a much more fleshed out character than any of the characters on the ship in the first film, who seemed kind of flat, and I was never really invested in them, whereas I thought it was a much better decision to focus more on the one fleshed out crew member rather than having a bunch of flat one note characters who didn't even survive until the end of the film. And I think The Matrix Reloaded had the advantage of building off of what was already established in the first film and didn't have to spend as much time world building as the first film did, and instead got to expand upon the future world that they lived in, which felt much more real and tangible in this film. For example, I loved how we saw multiple ships with multiple crews rather than just having the Nebuchadnezzar as the only ship we saw. Also, I felt they handled the fact that Neo was the one very well, and it was interesting to see where they took his story from here, because it's, it could have been a problem as they made his character so powerful it could become boring, which is the Superman problem, because the most interesting characters are flawed ones, so when a character becomes invincible, he becomes a bit less interesting. However, I felt this film did an amazing job of setting realistic obstacles for him by introducing us to a world of rogue programs. And again, this would also was really helped with world building. And I'll be completely honest, I liked the action sequences in Reloaded much better. In particular was the highway action sequence, which in my opinion is one of the best action sequences from any film and is by far the best action sequence in the entire trilogy. I don't really care what anyone else thinks about it. I personally love it, and I find it far more thrilling than anything in the first film. And again, I think this has to do with the fact that Reloaded just had a better and a more dynamic story that I was just much more invested in. But of course, Reloaded isn't without its flaws, as I wasn't a fan of the whole Agent Smith storyline and how he was making multiple copies of himself. I think they just liked Hugo Weaving too much and wanted to bring him back, so they created this ridiculous storyline about him in order to keep him around, when really they should have just came up with another villain. And yes, that fight scene with Neo, where he was fighting a shitload of Agent Smiths, was really long and boring, and I did kind of doze off during that sequence. And yes, having a rave at Zion was a bit ridiculous, and it was too obvious they were trying to be all edgy and sexy, and it was just silly. And the whole thing with the chick who demanded Neo kiss her before that she would help them, well, that was just plain stupid. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Reloaded is a perfect movie. I'm just personally enjoyed it a lot more. I think that Reloaded has a lot of its own interesting philosophical aspects, such as the conundrum of free will versus predestination, which I believe was the natural progression to go from the first film, which dealt in prophecy about Neo being the one, a notion I felt was rather simplistic, and Reloaded did a good job of making it more complex and interesting, as we constantly get themes about how much this choice and free will really factor into life, particularly compared with machines that factor everything out and boil everything down to an equation when they practically have everything figured out and know what you're going to do next. Which leads me to the architect scene, which I constantly see people ragging on this scene and putting it down, but I absolutely loved it. This is one of my favorite scenes of the entire trilogy, and frankly, it is a major factor in why I like this film more than the first. A lot of people complain that it's too confusing and it makes no sense. I'd be lying if I said I completely understood it 100%, but it makes enough sense to be good. It makes as much sense as it needs to. I love the style of it, as whenever the architect says something, we see a multitude of TVs with all of Neo's different reactions until it settles on one, and that's the one reaction that Neo goes with. I thought that was great, and overall I just enjoyed this whole sequence and felt it really enhanced the story. You know, it's funny that Damon Lindelof of Lost once gave this as an example of a horribly bad expositional scene and said that it's something he always tried to avoid doing in Lost. Personally, I think the end of Lost would have been far superior if they had a scene as good as this one, but that's just me. But other than this scene, the ending where Neo struggles to save Trinity's life after he was told she was going to die and there was nothing he could do about it was amazing. Not only was it really intense and emotionally effective, it also gave you a sense of hope that the architect was wrong and choice had a larger effect than he believed. After all, he's just a machine looking at things from a stance of pure logistics and overlooking the human element. And the cliffhanger was great as well, as it set up an extremely dire and hopeless situation where everything looked like it was doomed. Morpheus lost his ship, Zion seemed like it was doomed, Agent Smith managed to infiltrate the real world. So in storytelling terms, I felt it was extremely effective. However, this is kind of undone by how horribly this was resolved in the next film, which was a total and complete failure that failed to live up to the standards that this film set, which I suppose makes this another similarity to Lost as an example of a story that's much better at setting up a situation than it is at resolving it. But at any rate, like both of these films, I like both of the first two Matrix films. I just liked the second one a little bit more because overall I just find myself more invested in it than the first, probably due to all the elements I explored earlier. Even though there's more stupid shit like the useless Agent Smith storyline and that stupid rave dance scene, I also think there's a lot more complexity and a lot more fleshed out story than the first, but that's just my opinion on it. So that's it for my Breaking Convention video on the Matrix Trilogy. If this video didn't piss you off too much, you can check out my channel for other Breaking Convention and film videos, including my top 50 favorite movies list, and be sure to subscribe for more Breaking Convention videos, and thanks a lot for watching.